Okay, welcome back everyone. So in the second part of this class, we are going to look at adding a little bit more complexity, a little bit more realism to the models of infection that we had designed in the first hour. I'm adding a package here, which is called Latexify, or Latexify, I suppose. And what it does is that it lets you get the LaTeX expression for a specific model. So if we do Latexify of SI, which is our model, we get this thing. This thing here is a LaTeX expression. If you use that in a weave document for your report, it is going to show up as a standard expression. But we can also pass that into something like Quick LaTeX, whatever. One of the many services that can render the LaTeX into something they can look at. And so what you can see is that this is actually writing the expression for us. This is writing the equation in a way that we can look at, and in a way that would be exactly like what we have in the textbook. So the d over dt of s is minus beta times si, and d over di over dt is b times s times I. So that is going to be something we can use if we want to look at what the equation that we are writing actually are. That is a useful thing to do because maybe you have written your code in a way that is not quite what you expect, and maybe by looking at the equation you can see that your reaction is not correct. So that's a useful thing to do. I'm just going to keep that open in case we want to revisit that later. Okay, so we have taken our SI model, and let's just rerun everything, make sure that it works. There was an error message that I didn't quite see. Malform reaction, why is that? Oh, it's because it needs to be 2 dash, I think. Yep. Okay. So let's do the plot here, and it is going to resolve everything, and it is going to give us this little plot that we had in the previous class. Perfect. So the first thing we want to do is add a very important biological process, which is the fact that in most cases, we tend to recover from infection. So what that means is that there is going to be a portion of the individuals that are infectious that are going to revert back to the susceptible state. Because, you get a cold and then you stop getting a cold, and so you are susceptible to yet another cold. Understand? So we're going to add another reaction here. Let me just actually do a second model. We are going to call that SIS. That stands for susceptible, infectious, susceptible. Because once you go through the infectious step, there is a chance that you will get back to being susceptible again. And to make that an actual model, we need to define a new reaction. So what is a reaction? Well, reverting to a state where you are susceptible, as opposed to being infectious, is not something that is going to be dependent on contact between individuals. It's something that will happen on its own. So it takes a single element into the reaction. We need a rate, which we are going to call gamma. Yeah, gamma is fine for now. And what gamma will require is a single infectious individual, and it will transform it back into a single susceptible individual. So then again, we're not changing the size of the population, right? It's something that someone that is infectious is going to get back to being susceptible. That's still a single unit of population. So the population is going to remain constant. There's no mortality, there's no demographic. It's just you get infected and then you don't. And then you get back to being susceptible again. So this model is called the SIS model, and we need to add a parameter here. So that's our model. Because we can look at the equation, let's have a look at the SIS model. I'm going to take that. If we were in something like a notebook, it would probably show up directly. We can look that the equation looks correct. We have the first process, which is loss of susceptible individual through infection by contact. And then we have a gain of susceptible infection through recovery, through remission. And then we have a gain of infectious individual by contact and a loss of infectious individual by recovery. That's cool. That's nice. That's what we want. The model is well written because it gives a well written equation. So in terms of parameters, we still need to have a parameter for the rate of infection, and we need to have a second parameter now, which is the rate of recovery. And the rate of recovery is going to be something that is expressed as a unit of time. One thing that is interesting is that if you take a rate and you take the inverse of a rate, that gives you the duration that you spend in a state. So let's say that it takes, 6 units of time. You remain infectious for an average 6 units of time. It means that the rate of recovery is 1/6. Every unit of time, you have 1/6 chance of reverting back to being susceptible. We're going to keep n equals 1,000. Note is going to be 1, so that means that our initial population is n minus 1 minus I note. We haven't added a compartment here, which is the important step, that we've added a way to move across compartments. For the moment, we still have only 2 states that you can have in the population. We're going to keep t equals 0 to, let's say, 200, whatever. So these are our parameters. And we are going to define a problem, which is an ODE problem, not an ODE function. That is SIS, note TP. And the solution to that is, as before, we solve the problem. So that's a new function. It needs to be compiled. It needs to have a little bit of time for pre-compilation, but now it's done, and we can plot the solution. Interesting. So in the previous situation, we reached an equilibrium where the individuals that were susceptible, they were extirpated from the population. Everyone was infectious by time 200. Let's zoom in a little bit. Let's say like 80 is good. But in this simulation, we have added something that is the ability of not being infectious anymore. And so you get sick and you infect other people, but after, give or take, 6 days, you revert back to not being infectious. And the consequence of that is that when we look at the number of individuals that are infectious at equilibrium, which we can get by looking at the last element in the solution, we get about 160, give or take, individuals that are susceptible, and we get about 833 individuals that are infectious. So there's still, like on average, the population is overwhelmingly infectious. But there is a group of people who have not yet been infected or have been infected but have lost their infectious status and are back to being susceptible. And that's interesting because it means that we still have a situation where the disease is able to persist in a population that is not entirely infected by it, which is nice. All that needed for that to happen was to add a single parameter that allows the infectious status to be lost. So let's make a few. Let's play with this model. Let's experiment. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. It's 40. I think it's fine. I haven't done this example yet. Okay, it's 40 is fine. What we want to, the question we should be asking, like the question that should be on everyone's mind at this point is, what happens if we change the value of the parameters, right? What if you remain infectious for a much longer time? There's two things that can happen, right? When you look at the time series, it can move horizontally or it can move vertically. That's one of the two things that's going to happen. So either we're going to see an infection that is going to reach the same endpoint, but faster or slower, or we are going to see an infection that is going to reach a different endpoint. It can also be a combination of both of these things. But the question is it going to change the timing of things, or is it going to change the state of things? So we are doubling the time where you remain infectious, from 6 to 12 days. So that's interesting. We're not changing the timing of the infection, but what we are changing is the time during which the total number of people that are infectious at equilibrium. What if instead you only remain infectious for 2 units of times? That's interesting. We reach an equilibrium where you have like half a chance. If you pick an individual at random from your population, you have a half a chance of this individual being infectious. What if you're only infectious for about 1.5 units of time? Well, what we see is that there is an endemic disease, but it ends up being a minority of people in the population. Let's get back to like 2.5. I think is fine. Yeah. So if we change the rate at which you lose your infectious status, what we change is the ratio between the number of individuals that are infectious and the number of individuals that are susceptible at the end of the simulation. And our immediate instinct when we see something like that should be to say, well, let's look at the relationship between these two quantities, right? That's what we want to figure out. So we're going to have a little ratio called I'll call that TI for the time that you spent being infectious, and it's going to change from 0.25 units of time by very small increments up until 10 units of times. And what we want to know is what is the proportion of individuals in the population that are infected. So what is the prevalence of that? And it's going to put that as zeros. And it's going to have the same length as TI. So 200 simulations. That's nothing. What do we want to do next? So what we want to do is for IT in enumerate TI. I haven't slept a lot. What we want to do is set these parameters as being, we keep the same rate of of transmission, but we want the rate of recovery to be 1/t. We want to change the rate at which individuals are becoming susceptible again. We're just going to specify everything here. No, we don't need to specify everything here, but we're going to do it because it's going to be easier to read, and that's more important. So U0 is equal to n minus I0 and I0. T is still going to be 0. Like, we could leave that be 40, but maybe when we pick a parameter value that is very small or very large, we don't know it's going to take more than 40. time steps for the dynamic to settle, and we don't want to be picking a point in the middle of a dynamic that has not reached its equilibrium. If we have something called a transient dynamic, something that is changing just a little bit, but over time it ends up being a big change. We don't want to sample that, so we're going to say 200. It's probably much more than we need, but we're safe. The simulation is fast, so we might as well do it this way. And we're going to get the solution directly. So it's going to solve an ODE problem of SIS U0TP. So what we want to put into the prevalence at position I is is what we're going to do. We're going to look at endpoint. The endpoint is the last state in the solution, and we want the number of infectious individuals, which is sol2 over n. So let's go here. Just because I think it's useful to know that, I'm going to add a package, which is called progress meter. And what progress meter is doing, I'm just going to put it here using progress meter. No, is that it's going to add a little progress bar to your simulations using progress meter, and the command is called show progress. Let's run that. Oh, it's not working. Cannot convert and oh, I see. So progress meter is requiring that we use only a single variable for iteration. So we're going to do each index, and it's going to be t of I. And I've also made a mistake here. That's going to be overwritten if we... No, it's not. Okay, we're good. All right. We'll get it. I don't know why show progress is not agreeing with what we were trying to do. But you know why? We don't need that. Okay, what's our issue here? Cannot convert an object of type array float64.1 to an object of type float64. Let me check. So what is TI? That's good. I'm just going to make sure that we expand that. Okay, that makes sense. What is prevalence? That's still 0. Let's have a look at each index. TI. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, that's good. That's n. I'm just going to make sure that it's doubles. Okay, so the reason is that I was not accessing the right object. But no, it's done. Okay, so it took 0 seconds to run 200 simulations. So now what we want to do is I want to plot TI over prevalence. Let's take a minute to appreciate this plot. Let's move the legend to the bottom right, and let's also change the theme so that we see what's up. Okay. Right. So there's an interesting thing going on here. So the prevalence here is what is the proportion of individuals that end up becoming that at the equilibrium end up being still infectious. So if that is 1, everyone is infectious. Like even though there is a reversion towards susceptibility, it's so small that everyone gets infected by the end. But if it's 0, it means that the disease is essentially it cannot establish itself, right? And so, like what we see here, let me add the correct axis names here. What we have here is time to lose infectious status, and the y-axis is prevalence. Prevalence. We're just going to, just let's try to go the extra mile and make a nice figure, because that's always more pleasant to look at. And we actually don't need a label. Okay, so that is interesting, right? There is a threshold here below which the disease is not establishing. So what that means is that if you lose your infectious status fast enough relative to something that we'll get to think about in a minute, you are not going to be able to create new infections. And so instead of having a process that is creation of new infectious people through contagions and then loss of infectious people through recovery, the loss of infectious people is going to be so strong that no new infectious individuals are created. And so the disease is not able to establish itself. So there's a combination of parameters for which not only do we change the behavior of the system to the point where instead of everyone being infected, only some people are infected. If it's very easy to lose the infectious status, we change the behavior of the system so that the disease goes away. So let's pick a short time. Let's say we're going to take p equal, going to keep the same one, and say it's like 0.25. So if we do that, and we solve the ODE problem here, right? And we plot the solution, what we see is that the disease is never establishing itself. There's no increase in the number of individuals over time. That's a very important result. It means that, you know, for a disease to be able to create an outbreak, it needs to have the right combination of parameters. You need to have the right properties. And that's something that we can see emerge in a system that is very simple. You are either susceptible or infectious, and sometimes you can stop being infectious. It only takes 2 variables and 2 parameters to see this behavior appear, which I think is really nice. So let's get back to this. Let's get back to this figure here. One thing I'm wondering, not really, but I'm just going to pretend like I do for the purpose of this class, is what if instead of changing only the time it takes to lose the infectious status, we could also change just how infectious the disease is? Because it seems to be like at some point, if you recover too fast, you're not able to create new infectious people. But if the disease is really infectious, even if you recover fast enough, maybe there's going to be some shifting of this curve, like up and down, left and right, something like that. So we're going to do something called TI, which is going to be we're going to keep this one, which is the time you spend infectious. And we are going to create a something called B, and it's going to be 10 to the, let's say, we're going to go from -3 by small points, like small increments, up until 0. 0 is unrealistic. We'll do -1. Oh, sorry, it's 10.0. So what we're going to do next is just like explore the behavior of the model by changing multiple parameters at once. And that's a very important step when you are working with a model. It's something that you should be doing all the time. It's like, what parameters is going to have an effect of a variable that is of biological interest to me? But also, what parameter is going to change the behavior of the system in a way that I can maybe use to understand something about the processes, and what are the interaction between these multiple parameters. And we can do that with the SIS model because it's simple. It only has two variables, two parameters, and we understand its behavior. But and there are techniques to do that with models with a lot more variables and a lot more parameters, but we're just going to see like the power of a good visualization for that. So our prevalence here is going to be, let's say, it's going to have the length of ti in one direction, and it's going to have the length of b in the other direction. So instead of being a single value, we have a matrix, right? And it's like 196 rows by 21 columns. And we're going to do for I in each index ti and for j in each index b. And all we need to change, remember, are these two lines here, where instead of having the same value, we are going to have, b at position j, and then prevalence, this is now an array with 2 dimensions. I'm going to make b a little larger just to see what's up. Okay, we have a new thing. Let's see how long that actually takes to run. It takes literally no time at all. I should have, anyway, it doesn't matter. So we could do, we could plot the prevalence, right? Plot prevalence, ti over prevalence, I think. Yes, it's going to be this one. It's frame equal box, and no legend. What we see here is sort of like an accumulation of curves, right? There's like a lot of different curves where we go from this one, prevalence is always 0, to this one, prevalence is almost always 1. That's not necessarily the best way to be representing this thing. Let's try with a heat map, and we have T, Y, and B, and then the prevalence. No, oh my god, sorry. Every time. Yes, okay. So what we have here, right, is let's annotate the axis again. The x-axis is going to be the rate of, let's call that transmissibility. Transmissibility. And the y-axis is the time to lose infectious status. So one of the things that we've done is that transmissibility is something that we've expressed on a log scale, and I'm not necessarily a big fan because it's sort of compressing the area with very important things that are happening. So we can just take the log 10 of that. So this is the model that we have. This is the result of our model, right? Where everything that is towards a brownish color is going to be the disease is not able to persist in this population. Everything that goes toward white is going to be everyone is infected by the end of the process. And that's interesting because there's this curve here. We can see it. We can't write. I mean, we won't, but it's an interesting exercise for you to write down the expression of this limit here that says if you are that infectious, you can afford to lose your infectious status that fast. But there's a compromise here, where a disease that is very transmissible even if it loses its infection status almost immediately, it doesn't really matter. It's so transmissible that it's going to overwhelm the loss of infectiousness. A disease that is very, very difficult to transmit, it needs to have a very long infectious period in order to persist, right? And that makes sense. If you think of that from a biological point of view, it's essentially saying your transmissibility, it's about, let's try to develop an intuition for what that means. That your transmissibility is, in a sense, how many contacts you need to achieve in order to create a new individual that is infectious. So that takes time. It's like, what is the average time after which you have turned someone who is susceptible into someone who is infectious? And if that time gets long, and possibly longer than the time it will take to lose your own status as being infectious, then the disease is not able to persist. But if it's shorter than that, if you can create more infectious people than you are losing through loss of infectiousness or recovery, then it is going to persist. I think that's an interesting plot. It's a very powerful plot because it tells us things about what are the combination of parameters that will give dynamic that we are interested in. It's also, that was a more technical point, but it's very fast to simulate, so we can do a really smooth figure. That's like 2 or 3 seconds to have something that is very nice. And so that's it goes to show that it's important to always be visualizing the outputs of your model, not necessarily the time series. They do hold a ton of information, but also plot 2 parameters together. Pick a variable of interest, pick something that you want to understand more about, and then have a look at that. Another, just purely for your curiosity, an alternative to the heat map is a contour plot that is going to add lines. And we're just going to use fill equal to, I think it's filled. It is not. It is fill. Yes. Okay. Oh, it's going to be mostly useful at making the thing that the quantity of interest discrete. Right, and so we have all of this area here where it's essentially no disease anymore. And then the more we move here, the more we can see like the disease is very present. Excuse me. Okay, so that's just the point was not to make the figure. The point was to get you to appreciate the importance of making figures when you are facing a new model, because there's a lot we can learn from looking at the equations. There's a lot we can learn by looking at the time series, but putting 2 parameters in a relationship and understanding their effects on one another, or the combination that give rise to desirable or undesirable outcomes, is very, very important in helping you build an intuition for your model. And as much as we would like the exercise of modeling to be a formal process, having an intuition for your model is extremely important. It's going to guide the thing that you want to look at. It's going to guide the sort of outcomes that you want to measure. And so it's never going to be time that you lose developing this familiarity with the model. And my tea is cold. Okay, so next step. Let's add a compartment. We're going to take about 10-ish minutes to do that because it's going to blend into the next, the 3rd module. I'm just going to get this little thing here. So one of the things that we've done so far is that we've added an arrow back into S from I. One thing that might happen is actually that instead of just not being infectious, we recover from the disease in such a way that we develop immunity. So we're going to create a model which is called SIR. And SIR That's where I should have named my variable something different, but it doesn't really matter. Instead of becoming susceptible, after some time, you become recovered or removed, depending on what paper or textbook you're reading. I use removed, which means that you're not part of the pool of individuals that are relevant for the transmission of the disease anymore. That is, I'm just going to try and convince you of that using Latexify. That is a new variable in the model, right? We have a third equation here. We are going to copy that and go and have a look at the little equation. Render. And now we have a third equation, right? And the portion of individuals that were going away from infectious into susceptible, now they go into a compartment of their own, which is a removed compartment. If we do the sum of that, minus infection plus infection minus recovery plus recovery, it's going to be still 0. The population size overall is still not changing. We still have a constant of movement in the model, which is a total number of individuals. But what we have now is a new dead end. Because we can track an individual that starts as being susceptible, it's going to move into being infectious, and thereafter some time, it's going to be removed from the model. It's not going to get back into susceptible. It's not going to get back into infectious either. It's going to remain here and not affect the dynamics of the disease spread anymore. So we can start making a prediction here, which is like the individual that start as susceptible and get infected will become infectious themselves, and then they'll move away from this compartment that matter. The remaining susceptible individuals, they will still be converted into infectious individual at some point. And because this is a finite quantity, there's no burst, there's no migration into the population. At some point, the pool of susceptible individuals is probably going to be exhausted. Or maybe the pool of infectious individuals is going to be exhausted. And so we should see a lot of the population that is in the removed compartment and the epidemic is over. Let's see if that checks out. So we're going to keep the same parameters as we picked before. Now we're going to use something where there's actually an epidemic going on. This one. We're going to pick the same n. We're going to pick the same initial number of infected people, but now we have a third. I'm just going to comment that adding recovery to the model. We are going to add a third population, which is a number of individuals that have been removed. And we are going to make the assumption that at the beginning, no one has been removed from the pool of individuals. That's the same thing as saying, from an immunological point of view, everyone is naive in the population, that no one has immunity against that. So we have a new model of a new time, and the solution is going to be solving of an ODE problem that is SIR U0TP. It's first time, we need the model to compile. And we can make a little plot. A little plot, we now have three different compartments in here. We have blue is susceptible, pink is infectious, and green is removed. So, sorry, I'm just going to do something, which is default frame equals box. I feel much better. Okay, so the early steps of the epidemics, right? Let's say, okay, let's do 1 to 10. We see a decrease in susceptible individuals. We see an increase in infectious individuals. That sort of makes sense because in order to have individuals that are removed, you first need them to be infectious, and there is a delay. There is a delay that's about 5.5 units of time. So that is progressing almost like in the SI model. But when we start accumulating time points, right, what we see is that at some point there are a lot of individuals that are infectious, and so they get converted effectively into removed individual at a rate that is really high. And now the rate of the removed compartment is almost like it's close to being linear over time. And by the end of the epidemics, what we see is a very slow change in the system. We can look at the last time step, where we have 4 individuals that are still susceptible. We have 0.6 individuals that are still infectious, and we have about 1,000 individuals that are removed. So that's interesting, right? The question we should be asking at this point is, if we let that run for a while, which compartment is going to be reaching 0 first? Is it going to be S, or is it going to be I? Or in other words, by the time the epidemic is over, well, some people remain that have not been infected. Let's do 1,000 time steps. It's still, instantaneous. That's obviously nothing we see in this plot, because everything happened in the first 20 time steps also. But if we look at the last solution, we have 4 susceptible individuals that remain. We have -1.5 to the -12 individuals that are infectious. That's a problem. It should be positive, but floating point numbers are difficult. If we really wanted that to be a constraint that we enforce, we could do that. We're not going to. It doesn't really matter here. And then we have 995 individuals that are removed. So what is interesting is that we have this epidemic that took place over a long period of time, and by the end, we can quantify the number of people that have not been infected. What does it mean from a biological point of view? Well, it means that because the individuals that lose their infectious status, they don't become susceptible again. They get removed. The number of contacts is decreasing. And so over time, the probability that an individual that is susceptible to the disease is going to run into an individual that is infectious is going to decrease. And by the end, there's a number of individuals that are not going to be, that will never have encountered an infectious individual in a way that will result in themselves becoming infectious. Again, now we have a more complex time series. So if we change anything about the parameters, we can start asking, is it going to change the maximum number of infectious people? Is it going to change the fact that some people have not been infected at the end of the epidemic? What if the time to be removed is much longer? Well, if the time to be removed is much longer, then we reach obviously a higher peak in the epidemics. It takes 12.5 units to recover from the disease. What if it takes only 1.5? Well, if it takes 1.5, then we have a very small peak, and then we have an overwhelming majority of the population that is, not an overwhelming majority, it's actually a modest minority of the population that is still susceptible by the end of the epidemic. If we keep the same situation, but we double the transmission, we have something that is entirely different. We have something that progresses much faster with a peak that is higher, and the epidemic is over soon. So all of this, I'm going to use a term in a way that I want to qualify again as not having real world implication, but this notion of flattening the curve by taking a rate of transmission and cutting it in half. It's doing that. It's taking the curve and making it flatter. It's also changing when the peak occurs. It's also changing how many people remain uninfected in the end. And so all of these curves, in a sense, because they are linked by movement of people across the different compartments, movement of individuals, they are not independent from one another. And so these models can be very complex very fast, and we're going to make them even more complex after the break, and also fully embrace the stochasticity. But that it's interesting to just question in a very systematic way what is the interaction between this parameter and this other parameter, and what is the impact of changing this parameter on the quantity of interest. I'd like to take maybe 5 minutes to try and do a little exercise, because here's a question that we have, right? If we change the if we change the rate of transmission, we are going to pick this one here. Yeah. What is when is the peak? When is the time when we have the maximum number of people that are infected? So it's going to be 0. Our time is units, is in floating point numbers. It's going to have the length of B. And we are going to do a little show progress for I in each index of B. That's going to be our model. It's going to be this thing. But here it's going to be BI. We're going to give it a little bit more time. That is going to be our solution. Let me check. What if we do solution? No. So if we want the second compartment, right? What is the first? Yes, that is the number of susceptible. That is the number of infected people. Number of infected people, what we want is when is it the largest? It's going to be the largest at time step 14 with 63 people infected. And so we're going to keep track of both these quantities, actually. Peak and Imax. Let me do a thing, because I think... Yes, okay. So what we want, so the infectious are going to be sol2. The peak is what is the maximum number of infectious. And what we want to put in Imax at position I is going to be the first value in the peak. What we want to do to put in the peak time is going to be sol.t of the last value of the peak. Let's run this little simulation. It's done already, cool. And so we can make a plot of B of a peak. And here's what we get. We're just going to do a quick little log10 axis. Here's what we have. For very low transmission rate, there is no peak. And then when the transmission rate increases, the peak is also happening faster, earlier in the epidemic. But what if we do plot of B and then the maximum number of people infectious during the peak? We'll have something that's slightly different, right? It's a lot more monotonous as an increase. So there's a rate of transmissibility values here. That means no epidemics taking place. The disease is not able to transmit itself efficiently, and so there's no peak, it's not growing. But then after we reach very high rates of transmission, we have a peak that is much intense. And so we have, in some cases, we have almost the entire population with infectious at the same time, which is probably telling us something about the fact that everyone is moved into the infectious compartment. So then again, that is an exploration of a behavior from the model. And what is interesting here, what is important, is that you can dig ever deeper into the time series to extract some information. And so you can start thinking about, what is the quantity that I want to measure? Where is it in the time series? How do I extract it? How do I turn that into information? And then what are the parameters that are going to be important for that? We will take a 15-minute break. It is now 11 past 5 past 11. So at 11:20, we'll start again, and we will add the final compartment to this model and move on to adding some stochasticity. I'll see you in 15 minutes.